Please, allow me to show you something.
Welcome back to the All in My Head podcast. I'm Jenny and I am your host, and you have landed here today for episode 35, and it is called Your Boundaries, Your Business. And today I want to talk about boundaries. Specifically, the idea that your boundaries are your business. And more importantly, they're no one else's. You know, somewhere along the way, we started talking about boundaries, and societally, it became another thing for people to think that they are doing it wrong. And I say that in air quotes. Social media is full of advice telling us exactly what healthy boundaries should look like. But what if healthy boundaries aren't universal? What if what works for one person would feel restrictive, unnecessary, or even harmful for someone else? Today, we're exploring why boundary setting is deeply personal and why you don't need anyone's permission to create boundaries that fit your life. You know, we often treat boundaries like there's one correct formula. I've seen so much online about the issues of boundaries, boundary setting, and a lot of people chiming in to tell you that you setting a boundary with someone is wrong, that the way you're setting a boundary with someone is wrong. And, you know, as with anything on social media, as with anything online, you know, there is great advice to be had and to be taken. But we also need to be looking at those and seeing if it fits our life and our vision for what we want for our life. You know, like I said, advice can be helpful, but it can also become very rigid. And, you know, when people, as we know and as we have seen in our society, especially as of late, when people have one vision and one way of thinking, they're going to stick to that. And they're going to take that with them to the end of days. And, you know, that's okay. And that may be fine for them, but it may not be right for you. And that's where we want to be looking at every situation in our life as a personal situation and how and what is best and healthy for us. You know, I recently watched an episode of another podcast, and the person was chiming in on the host and saying that this host was creating this atmosphere of, you know, cut your parents off or cut your family off and never talk to them again. And that, you know, the person who was calling that host out on that was telling everyone that they should repair their relationship with their parent, their sibling, or their family member, no matter what. And that, you know, you cannot and should not be going no contact with a parent, and made that as a universal statement and shared their experience where their parent was open to having a conversation with them and finding out what they could do to help foster a better and healthier relationship moving forward. So that was wonderful for her. But that's not universal. And so to say you should go no contact, you shouldn't go no contact, and you cannot go no contact with a parent or close family member is a big statement to make from someone who isn't directly involved in that relationship, in your relationship. They don't know what's going on behind the scenes in your relationship. And for them, it worked to have a conversation with this parent and say, this is what I need from you moving forward. I would like to do therapy. I would like to, have these conversations with a third party and try to guide our relationship into a better space. And that parent, that family member was open to that. That is not the case with everyone. And that is not the case with a lot of people. So to make that statement and say, you cannot do this and you must repair your relationship is not one size fits all. So for that, I would again say take that with a grain of salt. If that works for you, great. If it doesn't, then you can move on from that conversation and that information and advice. Boundaries are not moral achievements. They're very personal, and not everyone can be in relationship with specific people because it is not healthy for them. Having boundaries doesn't mean that you automatically are going to make someone healthier. Truly, the boundary is not for the other person. It is for you. It is for you, and it is for your health, and it is for your peace of mind, and it is for your safety sometimes. And so, you know, boundaries are very individual. Having fewer boundaries doesn't automatically make someone healthy either or make them unhealthy. So to look at each of those situations as personal and as what would work for you is key, right? Boundaries are tools. They're not trophies. And everyone's personal circumstances are different. It could be a personality conflict. It can be a cultural conflict. It can be a family dynamic, a history of trauma, relationship needs change, work demands, energy levels. There's so many reasons why a person can and will create a boundary. And what feels safe for one person may feel very isolating for another person. One person may need daily solitude. Another person may thrive on frequent connection. One person may say, I am not going to answer emails after 5 p.m. And another person generally doesn't mind getting those. One person limits family contact, and another maintains close family relationships without issue. And again, these can go for family. This can go for work. This can go for friendships. We're talking about boundaries in the general sense. And, for me, I've talked about boundary setting and setting hard boundaries and setting some loose boundaries with people. And, it has been important for my growth, for my mental health. It has taught me so much about what I am as a person and as a woman, as a Latina woman in the society. I have grown exponentially in learning that it's okay to set boundaries, especially women and, women of color, even more so, right? We're not given permission to be able to say no to things and tell people that it's not okay. We normalize a lot of these behaviors in our culture, and we look at people in a general sense and say, well, because they have this role in our lives, it's okay. And we're also told that it's normal. Um, so for me to be able to take that information and to reflect upon it, I've talked about it so many times in journaling and in therapy, to be able to look at your individual circumstance and to say, that's not okay. I'm not going to accept that any longer. And to put boundaries in place and say, if this behavior continues, then I cannot continue a relationship in the same way is sometimes what has to be done. And again, to hear of people saying that no matter what, you need to have a relationship with a person because of the role that they play in your family is not okay to generalize that statement because no one knows what you're going through. And if a person is dealing with trauma and is being and if there's any abusive behavior or abusive language or any of that type of behavior, no one has to deal with that, no matter what the role a person plays in your family or in your life. So to look at each situation as an individual situation and say, this is what is okay for me, and it may not be okay for you, and vice versa. Sometimes when we set these boundaries, we think it's going to look one way, and it may look very different. And learning to grow into that and to understand that sometimes we may need to loosen boundaries and sometimes we may need to strengthen them. And whatever you're doing is okay because it's for you and it's for your well being. And I think that's the biggest message in that is that boundaries should serve your well being, not someone else's definition of wellness. One of the most interesting things about boundaries is that people usually support them. Most people will support them until you set one they don't like. And I'm not sure if you've noticed that, but I have noticed that. People will say, oh, I think that's a good idea. You may need to set a boundary. You should do that for yourself. But when they don't like it, or when it's a boundary that's set on them, their perspective might change drastically. And you have to be okay with that. You have to be okay with the fact that people might have opinions and it may change the dynamic drastically. People will tell you to protect your health and to protect your peace and take care of yourself, prioritize your mental health. But the moment you establish a boundary with a parent, a sibling, a spouse, another family member, suddenly those conversations change. And, people will make that judgment and that conversation public a lot of the times. And, you have to be okay with that. Oftentimes we hear these statements from people. Those are your parents. You can't set boundaries like that. You only get one mother. You only get one father. And you should honor them no matter what. And again, while I understand where those beliefs come from, I heard them a lot growing up. I heard that so much in so many conversations. I think they miss something very important. Having a boundary is not the same thing as withholding love. Having a boundary is not the same thing as being ungrateful. Having a boundary is not the same thing as rejecting someone. Boundary is simply recognizing that a relationship can exist and still require limits. Or there are times where no contact is the only option. And the truth is that some of us grew up believing that family members were automatically entitled to unlimited access to us. to our time, to our energy, to our emotions, to our decisions. But adulthood invites a different question. Can I love someone and still need boundaries with them? And I believe the answer is yes. For some people, that boundary may be as simple as not discussing certain topics. And this is huge, especially as of late in this climate, in our world. There may just be some times where we're with someone that we love and that we want to spend time with, but we're not talking about specific things. And that's okay. Knowing that and being able to walk in that space with someone and having a conversation about what we're going to talk about and what is off the table is important. And I think that that's what being an adult is, right? Navigating these relationships with honesty and openness. And for others, it may mean limiting visits. And for others, it may mean ending conversations when they become hurtful. If someone is hurting you and if someone is saying hurtful things to you, it's not okay. And you don't have to accept that. And for some, after years of trying everything else, it may mean creating significant distance. The point is that everyone should make those decisions for themselves. And it isn't that everyone should make the same choice. The point is that no one else gets to decide what level of access another human being is entitled to have in your life. Not me, not a podcast host, not a therapist, not a talk show host, not a stranger on the internet, and certainly not someone who has never lived your story. Your story is individual. You're the only person living it. So if someone's not living your story, they don't get to make those choices. And here's what I've learned. The people who tell you that boundaries are wrong often assume they know the whole story. And most often, they do not. They don't know what happened behind closed doors. They don't know the conversations you've had. They don't know the attempts you've made. They don't know what it has cost you to stay connected. They see the boundary. They don't see the history that created it. And oftentimes that is because things are hidden, things are not spoken of, conversations are hushed, and a person or persons may present themselves in a different way in a public space. So people on the outside don't necessarily know how you've reached this point or why. And that's why your boundaries are your business. Not because they're secret, not because they're selfish, but because you're the one who has to live with the consequences of not having them. No one should tolerate abusive behavior from anyone. If someone does not respect you, they do not deserve to be a part of your life, period. And they're missing out. Boundaries, right? Boundaries are not punishments. They're not ultimatums. And they're not an attempt to change someone else. The person on the receiving end may feel that way. And you have to be okay with that. If they're not willing to open that line of communication and hear the bigger conversation and hear from you what is hurting you, then that's how it is probably received. But truly, boundaries are information. and what you're not available for. Some simple examples could be you have to stop calling me late at night. I don't answer calls, you know, after 9 p.m. So instead of saying you have to stop calling me late at night, somebody may receive that as aggressive. You can simply say, I don't receive calls after 9 p.m., right? Instead of saying you need to respect me. Try if a conversation becomes disrespectful, I will end it. Healthy boundaries focus on your behavior, not controlling someone else's. And, one of the least discussed truths about boundaries is they can change. What you needed at 25 may not be what you need at 55. Boundaries evolve as relationships evolve, as healing happens, as circumstances change, and as confidence grows. And I know that what I tolerated in my 20s and 30s, I don't in my 50s. I've grown, I have healed, and I have learned to protect my peace. But you're also allowed to tighten a boundary, to relax a boundary, to reconsider a boundary, and even to experiment with a boundary. I think questions to ask yourself are, especially if you're stepping into these boundary setting or receiving even, which boundaries in your life feel authentic? And which boundaries feel borrowed from someone else's playbook? Growth isn't about having perfect boundaries. Growth is about having honest ones. I think those are the most important things as we look at this. As we talk about boundaries and as we talk about, what they look like in our life, think about fence. A fence around your yard, you protect your property. You can protect your personal space as well, but not everyone needs the same fence. Some people's fences are going to be very high. Some are going to be lower and less of a restriction. But you don't need permission to draw your own line. Your boundaries don't need anyone's approval because boundaries aren't one size fits all. Boundaries are personal and boundaries are your business. And I think that is the perfect way to kind of close this episode. Again, there is so much information out there, and there are so many opinions, and there is so much advice. Take what you need, but leave the rest. Take what's for you and what you feel will work in your life. Not every boundary will make sense to everyone. Some people will think your boundary is too strict. Others will think it's not strict enough. Neither group gets a vote. Your boundaries are not a public project. They are private decisions about how you want to move through the world. The goal isn't to build walls around your life. The goal is to create enough space for peace, authenticity, and healthy connections. Because, like I said, at the end of the day, your boundaries are your business. I'd like to leave you with a question. What's one boundary you've created that truly fits who you are, not who someone else thinks you should be? Take that, maybe sit with that, and also sit with, am I taking advice and utilizing it in a space where it doesn't fit? You get to create your rules and guidelines around your life. No one else gets to do that. I hope this resonated with you today. I hope that you are taking any information that you're receiving and using it to protect your space, your peace, and your mental health. Loving yourself is first and foremost. So, knowing how to do that and growing in the confidence to be able to set boundaries and guidelines over what you want in your life is okay. And what looks right for you may not look right for someone else. And that's okay. Thank you for listening to the All in My Head podcast. I hope you have a beautiful and peaceful day.